The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. This essay was written on February 17, 2011. The professor, Dr. Michael Kithinji. The course is History 3603, Pre-Colonial African History. The assignment is to read and comment on one of the slave narratives located on the University of North Carolina website, link in the description box below. I've chosen for this particular assignment a classical work of literature that I became familiar with a number of years ago, but never completely read. Technically, of course, I still haven't read it completely, as this particular work consists of the first 100 pages of a 1,000-page book containing all three of Mr. Douglass's autobiographical works in a single anthology. I promise to read the other two books in due time. I have always liked Douglass's work for one particular reason. Among the slaveholding antebellum South, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read. As Douglass tells it, one of his mistresses, that is, the wife of one of the slave masters, took the effort to attempt to teach young Freddie how to read until her husband prevented her from continuing. But these first few lessons were enough to whet his appetite for literacy, and was often caught reading the newspapers or other materials. He described instances when he challenged the white boys in his neighborhood that he knew more letters than they did, in effect tricking these boys into teaching him more. So essentially, Frederick Douglass ostensibly taught himself how to read, and this knowledge compelled him to seek out all advantages and opportunities to escape. As Douglass stated, education and slavery are incompatible. Slavery was, and in cases where it is still found, still is, a great evil, but there were reasons why it persisted for so long. The issue, with both Douglass and more modern commentators quick to point out, was that slavery was bound to the Christian church in the South, which provided the moral impetus for the phenomenon to continue. Many atheists, secular humanists, and other skeptics trying to find objections to organized religion find many examples of the horrors of religious belief beyond the obvious problems of terrorism and violent extremism. We find such objections in a notable work of Christopher Hitchens in his self-described God-bashing book, God is Not Great. Note, of course, that almost every instance of the word God in his book, including cover and title page, are rendered in lower case, but he has enough journalistic integrity to capitalize a word when directly quoting other people. Hitchens described the American slavery experience thusly. Take the memorable story of Black America as our instance. We should find, first, that the enslaved were not captives of some pharaoh, but of several Christian states and societies that for many years operated a triangular trade between the west coast of Africa and the eastern seaboard of North America and the capitals of Europe. This huge and terrible industry was blessed by all churches and for a long time aroused absolutely no religious protest. Interestingly, Hitchens went on to describe a lesser-known secondary slave trade. Its counterpart, the slave trade in the Mediterranean and North America, was explicitly endorsed by and carried out in the name of Islam. On the other hand, certain people have been honest enough to point out that the phenomenon of slavery as promulgated in the Bible does not match the slavery experience of the American antebellum South. YouTube videographer Frederick made an attempt to address these issues and certain misconceptions in a recent video of his Atheist Reads the Bible series.
Look, if slavery is so wrong, Jesus had every chance to stop it, to speak out against it, but he did not. Slavery occurred during the time of Jesus. Slavery continued after Jesus. It wasn't until nearly 2,000 years later that we put an end to it. But guess what never changed? The Bible. The words in the book were the same 1,500 years ago as they are today. And that's why when you hear idiots like the good reverends from the beginning of this video say what they did, you can't deny that they were at least backing up their terrible claims with chapter and verse. So what changed from then until now? It wasn't the Bible. Those verses in both the Old and New Testaments are now ignored by even their followers. It was us. It was mankind. We moved on from that. God wasn't changing, so we did. And it cannot be driven home any harder than by the great abolitionist himself, Frederick Douglass. When speaking about the transition from being a slave to being a free man, Frederick Douglass said, I prayed for 20 years but received no answer until I prayed with my legs.
I also had to address the issue of slavery in the Bible in my attempt to thoroughly study the 10 Commandments in my own YouTube series, The 10 Suggestions. I felt almost compelled to address biblical slavery in the same frank, matter-of-fact tone as the Bible addressed slavery in Exodus chapter 20. Specifically, Commandment number 4, not only were the Israelites to observe the Yom Shabbat, or the Sabbath day, from Friday afternoon to at sundown to Saturday afternoon to sundown, this commandment included the male slaves, female slaves, and the strangers within their gates. Commandment number 7, certainly the Israelites were not prohibited from committing adultery. For some reason, this commandment did not extend to acts of child rape, including sexual assault with prepubescent girls taken captives as prisoners of war. Whether Bible propagandists want to believe it or not, the Bible actually commands believers to rape female slaves. Commandment number 8. According to the Jewish Talmud, the act of theft prohibited in this commandment extended to the crime of men stealing, defining the act of stealing another person's slaves, but did not extend to the act of kidnapping war captives as previously described. Commandment number 10. Israelites were prohibited from coveting, that is, a mere thought crime, another person's property, which included the neighbor's wife, as well as his male and female slaves. The hypocrisy of the religious impetus behind American slavery institution was not lost on our featured author, Frederick Dougkass. He said that they found the religious slave masters and overseers as being worse than the non-religious ones. As he opined, a non-religious slave master who committed evil or immoral acts, such as excessive abuse of his slaves, did so simply because he was evil and immoral. But an allegedly religious slave master who committed these types of actions did so because he had a religious-based sanction for his crimes. Dougkass said, "I assert unhesitatingly that the religion of the South is a mere covering for the most horrid crimes, a justifier of the most appalling barbarity, a sanctifier of evil frauds, a dark shelter under which the darkest, foulest, grossest, and most infernal deeds of slave owners find the strongest protection." His maxim was, "Behave well or behave ill, it is the duty of a master occasionally to whip a slave to remind him of his master's authority." As evil and barbaric as biblically sanctioned slavery was, it has been well noted that the American slavery experience was much worse and far more nightmarish than any religious fundamentalist can honestly justify. American slavery was brutal, with slaves living in abject poverty, destitute of the basic necessities of life. Slaves were hungry, cold, practically naked, unkept, and unlearned. They were constantly overworked, and when they couldn't continue working, they were beaten and abused and sometimes killed. Dougkass told of one horrible example of such brutality involving a member of his own family. The offense for which this girl was murdered was this. She had been set that night to remind Mrs. Hick's baby, and during the night she fell asleep, and the baby cried. She, having lost her rest for several nights previous, did not hear the crying. They were both in the rooms with Mrs. Hicks. Mrs. Hicks, finding the girl slow to move, jumped from her bed, seized an oak stick of wood by the fireplace, and with it broke the girl's nose and breastbone, and thus ended her life. I will not say that this most horrid murder created no sensation in the community. It did produce sensation, but not enough to bring the murderess to punishment. There was a warrant issued for her arrest, but it was never served. She thus escaped not only punishment, but even the pain of being arraigned before a court for her crime. Even beyond the religious aspects of slavery, it is important to note the sociological aspects as well. We can read about such sociological concerns with some of the slaves' narratives, as well as the important works of literature that appeared during this time frame. The first one I want to explore is Harriet Beecher Stowe's important book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. It is important, of course, to read this book with the understanding of the unique bias of the author. Stowe was the daughter of Lyman Beecher, a prominent Christian minister, and was a member of a prominent family within the abolitionist movement. It is important to note, even though the main characters in Uncle Tom's Cabin were slaves, several of them in active rebellion and attempting to run away, Stowe was careless to present her slaves as mere caricatures, frequently identifying the whole African race as shiftless, unclean, uneducated, and worthless without constant help from caring white people. Bear in mind that this was a northern abolitionist that wanted to cast Africans in a good light. The other work I wanted to examine was Margaret Mitchell's magnum opus, Gone with the Wind. Now, we have seen from the outset that Gone with the Wind is less valuable as a source, as it was published in 1939, several decades after the events that the book dramatizes. Further, just as Uncle Tom's Cabin must be read from the perspective of a Yankee abolitionist, Gone with the Wind must be read from the perspective of a Southern Confederate sympathizer and descendant of former slave owners. But what distinguishes Margaret Mitchell from her predecessor was that Mitchell's father was a Civil War historian, and her work was highly researched. Mitchell explored the sociological issues of slavery, including changes to society during the Civil War and the following Reconstruction era. As she tells it, there were differences in social strata not only with the white people, to which slave-owning plantation ministers were higher social status than the poor white trash, but also with the former slaves. The lower status field hands became free-issued Negroes who could not find employment after emancipation, whereas the house servants tended to stay with their former masters. These social aspects are echoed in Douglass's narrative. He describes several instances of outright racism throughout his account. In one case, he was attempting to learn carpentry, but was thwarted by journeymen carpenters who gave up on him and assaulted him to keep him away from the job. Later on, he was trained to be a caulker by trade, but had to change professors again when he couldn't find work. This directly contradicts both Stowe's and Mitchell's opinions, as well as the Dutch Boer colonists, that Africans cannot be educated and cannot earn a living wage, and are to rely wholly upon the gracious humanitarian efforts of white people. Frederick Douglass proved this idea wrong. Once again, as he stated, education and slavery are incompatible. I want to close with one more statement from Douglass. Frederick Douglass was, of course, a very devout Christian, but like me, he was confounded by the apparent hypocritical religiosity promulgated by the Southern slave owners. This presented a clear moral conundrum. How could he criticize slavery in general, and slave owners in particular, without criticizing their religion that provides a moral basis? And how can he criticize their religion without criticizing his own? Similarly, how am I supposed to convince atheists and agnostic critics to have respect for people's religions when they can and do counter with examples of great acts of evil and immorality committed by religious people, none of which can be justified by a non-believing or secular ideology? The only effective method is to clearly establish a differentiation between the immoral actions of extremists and terrorists who use religion for religious purposes and the more moderate individualists, such as a certain African professor inexplicably named Matthew, who endeavor to use their religious beliefs to effect positive differences in society around them. But this leads me to the very moral question I am currently struggling with as of the moment I am typing this sentence. I am sure that I can have respect for a religious person who uses his beliefs for positive purposes, but am I to respect this person for his faith, or am I to respect him for his humanitarianism, irrespective of his religious beliefs? That is a difficult question. I'm sure it will take a while before I can find some suitable philosophical answer. In the meantime, I can console myself with the fact that I am not the first person to have to attempt to answer this particular conundrum. The following is Frederick Douglass's attempt to provide this answer, taken from the appendix to his narrative. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-owning, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason, but the most deceitful one, for calling the religious of this land Christianity. We have men stealers for ministers, women whippers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week, fills a pulpit on Sunday, and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sisters for purposes of prostitution stands forth as a pious advocate of purity. He who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible denies me the right of learning to read the name of God who made me. He who is the religious advocate of marriage robs millions of his sacred influence and leads them to the ravages of wholesale pollution. Here we have religion and robbery, allies of each other, devils dressed in angels' robes, and hell presenting the semblance of paradise. So, just a quick addendum to the original essay. As I said earlier in the video, the book, hey, Frederick Douglass in 3D, consists of the 3 autobiographies that he wrote. The first 2 it didn't include a certain particular piece of information that the third one did. That was his actual escape from slavery. He did not include this in the first 2 editions of his autobiography because they were written before the Civil War actually broke out, before the emancipation of the slaves, and he was worried that if he revealed the information of how he actually escaped, it would preclude other escapees from being able to use this method. Essentially, what he did is fairly common among the slaves. He used the identity of a freed person who sort of matched the description of the person that was trying to escape. And once they made the escape, they sent this paperwork back to the original person. This included an extreme amount of risk, because of course, if the person was caught, not only would the escaped slave be sent back to slavery, but the person, the freedman who links him his identification, would be liable to jail, because it was aiding the escape of a slave is a felony. What Douglass did makes me even more proud of the guy. I love this guy, dear to my heart. He impersonated a sailor. That's right. Now, granted, he impersonated a civilian mariner, but still, he did it pretty ingeniously. Of course, Frederick Douglass knew how to impersonate a sailor because he worked in Baltimore Harbor. He was an apprentice carpenter, and later on became a caulker in Baltimore Harbor. He hung around with sailors. He knew his ship. He knew everything about it. As we say, the keel of the mast, fantail of forecastle. He knew what he was talking about. He knew how to pass himself off as a sailor. He knew how to dress as a sailor. He said he was wearing a red shirt with a black sailor's hat. So when he got on the train, the conductor came to talk to him and asked for his free papers. What he said was, "What, are you kidding me? I don't take my free papers to sea with me." Genius. I love this guy. He said, well, what identification do you have? He said, well, I have these workers' papers. And he said, well, the actual papers that the sailor used when he went out to sea. The problem is that the description of the person that the papers belonged to didn't match Frederick Douglass at all. So if this conductor actually looked at the paperwork, he'd be caught. He took a look at the paper, he saw the American Eagle at the top of the paper, said, yeah, that American Eagle allows me to go all over the world, representing my country. And what did the conductor say? Good for you, young man. Brilliant. I love this guy. Anyway, as everybody else in my class already knows, there is another essay for this class, so there will be another video based upon that essay, so I'll keep you posted. Thank you for watching.
Here's some other books that you might like, but you don't have to take my word for it.
Come on and swing down Chariot, stop and let me ride.
Swing down, Chariot, stop and let me
Oh,
ride.
why don't you rock me, Lord?
Come and easy.
Hi,
I got a home on the other side.
6 white horses prancing side by side.
6 white horses prancing
Oh,
side by
I
side.
want you to rock me, Lord.
Come and easy.
I've got a home on the other side. Swing low, and let me ride. Swing low. Well, Ezekiel went down in the middle of the field, said he saw an angel with a chariot wheel. Wasn't too particular about the chariot wheel, he just wanted to know how the chariot feels. Swing down, Chariot, stop and let me ride.
Swing down, Chariot, stop and let me ride.
Rock me, Lord, rock me,